Joy Reid leaned into her MSNBC camera with that familiar look of moral outrage and pointed her finger at Vivek Ramaswamy. "You're nothing but a white supremacist enabler using dangerous rhetoric," she declared with passionate fury. Reid's progressive audience nodded along, thinking their host had delivered the perfect racial justice takedown. But what Reid didn't know was that Vivek had researched her entire history of spreading conspiracy theories and fake hacking claims. Vivek's response about Reid's conspiracy theory record would completely destroy her credibility and expose the ultimate race-baiting fraud. The MSNBC studio was charged with a kind of progressive energy that had made Joy Reid's show a must-watch program for liberal activists and racial justice advocates. The sleek set, with its modern graphics and carefully designed lighting, projected the image of serious journalism combined with moral authority that the network used to position itself as the voice of marginalized communities. Joy Reid sat behind her anchor desk with a confidence that came from years of being celebrated as one of cable news's most influential voices on racial issues. Her perfectly styled hair and professional wardrobe projected the image of someone who had successfully transformed activism into mainstream media success, becoming a powerful voice for progressive causes. Since rising to prominence at MSNBC, Reid had built her brand on a unique combination of racial commentary and political analysis that allowed her to make serious accusations about racism and extremism while maintaining the protection of being a cable news host. Her audience consisted largely of progressive viewers who appreciated her willingness to call out what they saw as dangerous rhetoric from conservative politicians. The show had invited Vivek Ramaswamy for what was billed as a discussion about his political positions and their impact on minority communities. It was supposed to be a typical MSNBC interview where a progressive host would use their platform to challenge a conservative politician while their audience nodded along approvingly. Vivek sat across from Reid in the studio, wearing a sharp charcoal suit, his demeanor calm but alert. He had appeared on hostile media before, but MSNBC represented a particular challenge when it came to discussions about race and identity. The network had built its brand on aggressive, progressive commentary that made it difficult for conservative guests to defend their positions without being labeled as extremists. The interview had started with questions about Vivek's background and his political positions, but everyone in the studio could sense that Reid was building towards something more confrontational. Her questions were becoming more pointed, more accusatory, and more focused on racial themes. "Vivek," Reid said, her voice taking on that familiar tone of moral authority that had made her a hero to progressive activists. "I want to talk about the rhetoric you've been using, particularly around issues of race and identity in America." The setup was classic Reid, positioning herself as the defender of minority communities while preparing to attack her guest's character and motivations. The studio audience, filled with MSNBC staffers and progressive activists, leaned forward in anticipation of another memorable confrontation. "I've been watching your speeches, your social media posts, your appearances on various programs," Reid continued, her voice growing more pointed. "And I have to say, I'm deeply concerned about the language you're using and the messages you're sending to certain segments of the population." Vivek remained calm, his hands folded, his expression attentive but untroubled. He had been expecting this kind of attack, and he was prepared for it. "You've made statements about diversity programs that echo white supremacist talking points," Reid pressed on, her voice rising with indignation. "You've used language about merit and qualifications that has historically been used to justify exclusion and discrimination. You've aligned yourself with narratives that make minority communities feel unsafe and unwelcome." The accusations were becoming more serious, more personal, and the studio audience was clearly enjoying the spectacle. They had come to see a conservative politician get exposed as a racial extremist, and Reid was building toward exactly that kind of moment. "And what really concerns me, Vivek," Reid said, leaning forward in her chair, her voice taking on that signature tone of moral outrage, "is that you're using your identity as a successful minority to provide cover for rhetoric that ultimately harms other minorities. You're being used as a token, as a shield for policies and positions that would hurt the very communities you claim to represent." The attack was building to its crescendo, and everyone in the studio could feel the tension ratcheting up. Reid was preparing to deliver what she clearly believed would be the killing blow to Vivek's credibility and moral standing. "So I have to ask you directly," Reid said, her voice echoing through the studio with righteous fury. "How do you justify using rhetoric that enables white supremacists? How do you reconcile your success in America with promoting ideas that would deny that same success to others?" She paused dramatically, letting her words sink in, before delivering the final accusation. "Because frankly, from where I sit, you're nothing but a white supremacist enabler using dangerous rhetoric that puts minority communities at risk. You're contributing to an environment where racism is normalized, where discrimination is justified, where the progress we've made toward racial justice is being rolled back." The studio erupted in murmurs of agreement, and Reid sat back in her chair with the satisfaction of someone who had just delivered a devastating moral judgment. She had used her platform to paint Vivek as a racial sellout who was betraying his own community for political gain. But what Reid didn't realize was that she had just made a catastrophic miscalculation. She had assumed that her position as a prominent black media figure and her reputation as a racial justice advocate would be enough to intimidate someone she clearly viewed as a traitor to minority interests. She had no idea that she was about to confront someone who had done extensive research on her own history of spreading false information and conspiracy theories. "Joy," Vivek said, his voice calm, but carrying an undercurrent of steel that made everyone in the studio pay attention. "I appreciate your concern about dangerous rhetoric and its impact on minority communities. I really do. But I have to ask you something, and I think your viewers deserve to hear your answer." The tone of the conversation was shifting, and Reid's confident expression began to falter slightly. She had expected Vivek to become defensive about the racism accusations or to offer some weak justification that would only make her attack look stronger. Instead, he was turning the tables and going on the offensive. "You just accused me of using dangerous rhetoric that enables white supremacists," Vivek continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. "You suggested that my words put minority communities at risk. You positioned yourself as someone who fights against harmful conspiracy theories and false information." He paused, letting his words sink in, his gaze steady and unwavering. "But I have to ask you, Joy, what gives you the moral authority to lecture anyone about dangerous rhetoric? What in your own history of spreading conspiracy theories qualifies you to determine what speech is harmful and what speech is legitimate?" The question hit the studio like a thunderbolt, and the audience fell into an uncomfortable silence. This wasn't how these interviews were supposed to go. Conservative guests were supposed to be defensive about racism accusations, not challenging the host's credibility to make them. "Because when I look at your own record," Vivek continued, his voice carrying across the studio with unmistakable authority, "I see someone who has repeatedly used her platform to spread false information, conspiracy theories, and divisive rhetoric that has actually harmed the communities you claim to protect." Reid sat rigid in her chair, clearly unprepared for this kind of direct challenge to her credibility. Her usual confidence was beginning to evaporate as she realized where this was heading. "Let's start with your most famous conspiracy theory," Vivek said, consulting his mental notes. "The hacking scandal. Do you remember that, Joy? When your old blog post surfaced containing homophobic content, and you claimed that your blog had been hacked." The studio was dead silent now, the atmosphere completely transformed from progressive celebration to shocked attention. Everyone in the room knew about the scandal, but it had been largely swept under the rug by sympathetic media coverage. You went on national television and claimed, with a straight face, that hackers had somehow gone back in time and inserted homophobic content into your blog posts from over a decade ago, Vivek continued, his voice rising with incredulity. You asked your audience to believe that sophisticated cybercriminals had targeted you specifically to plant anti-gay rhetoric in your old writings. The details of the scandal were devastating when laid out clearly, and everyone in the studio could see how absurd Reid's explanation had been. "That's not just a lie, Joy," Vivek said, his voice taking on a tone of genuine concern. "That's a conspiracy theory. That's exactly the kind of dangerous rhetoric you claim to oppose. You used your platform to spread false information to protect your own reputation, regardless of how it might affect public trust in media or the gay rights movement you claim to support. The attack was devastating because it used Reid's own standards against her, showing how her behavior had violated the very principles she claimed to uphold. But here's what makes it even worse, Vivek continued, his momentum building. When the FBI investigated your hacking claims, what did they find? Nothing. No evidence of hacking. No signs of external manipulation. No proof whatsoever that your story was true. The silence in the studio was deafening, and Reid's earlier confidence had completely disappeared. She was facing the kind of direct confrontation with her own dishonesty that her position at MSNBC had largely protected her from. So you had a choice, Vivek said, his voice becoming more pointed. You could admit that you had written homophobic content and apologize to the LGBTQ community. Or you could double down on a conspiracy theory that made you look either dishonest or delusional. And you chose the conspiracy theory. The moral failure was being exposed in real time, and everyone in the studio could see how Reid had prioritized her own reputation over truth and accountability. But that's not your only conspiracy theory, is it? Vivek asked, pulling out his phone. Let's talk about your claims about Russian interference in the 2016 election. Not the actual interference that occurred, but the wild theories you promoted that went far beyond established facts. The transition to another conspiracy theory showed that Reid's pattern of behavior wasn't isolated, but systematic. You repeatedly claimed on your show that the 2016 election results were illegitimate, Vivek continued. You promoted theories about vote manipulation that had no basis in evidence. You used your platform to convince your viewers that American democracy itself was compromised, based on speculation and partisan wishful thinking rather than facts. The parallel between Reid's election conspiracy theories and the ones she criticized from conservatives was becoming clear, and it highlighted her fundamental hypocrisy. For 3 years, you told your audience that Donald Trump was an illegitimate president installed by Russian hackers, Vivek said. You promoted theories about collusion and conspiracy that the Mueller investigation ultimately couldn't substantiate. You created an atmosphere of suspicion and distrust that damaged American democratic institutions. The room was completely silent now, everyone absorbing the systematic exposure of Reid's role in spreading false information. And when your theories were proven wrong, Vivek continued, when the Mueller report failed to establish the collusion you had been promoting, did you apologize? Did you acknowledge that you had misled your audience? Did you take responsibility for the conspiracy theories you had spread? The questions were rhetorical but devastating, highlighting Reid's complete lack of accountability for her false claims. Of course not, Vivek answered his own questions. You just moved on to the next conspiracy theory, the next false narrative, the next opportunity to divide Americans and spread distrust in our institutions. The pattern of behavior was being exposed as a consistent approach to media manipulation rather than isolated incidents. But here's what really bothers me about your approach, Joy, Vivek said, his voice taking on a more personal tone. You don't just spread conspiracy theories. You use racial identity as a shield to protect yourself from criticism when your theories are exposed as false. The accusation was particularly powerful because it highlighted how Reid weaponized identity politics to avoid accountability. When people challenge your conspiracy theories, you claim they're attacking you because you're a black woman, Vivek continued. When your false claims are exposed, you suggest that the criticism is motivated by racism rather than a legitimate desire for truth and accuracy. The manipulation tactic was being exposed, showing how Reid used identity politics to deflect from her own professional failures. That's not racial justice advocacy, Joy, Vivek said, his voice rising with conviction. That's using racial identity as a get-out-of-jail-free card for journalistic malpractice. That's exploiting the real struggles of minority communities to protect your own career from the consequences of spreading false information. The room was completely captivated now, everyone recognizing the fundamental dishonesty of Reid's approach to criticism and accountability. And let's talk about the real harm your conspiracy theories have caused, Vivek continued, his voice taking on a tone of genuine concern. When you spread false information about elections, You undermine faith in democratic institutions. When you promote unsubstantiated theories about Russian interference, you contribute to political polarization and distrust. The broader social damage caused by Reid's conspiracy theories was being highlighted, showing how her behavior had actual consequences beyond her own career. When you lie about being hacked rather than owning up to past mistakes, you teach your audience that accountability doesn't matter, Vivek said. When you use racial identity to deflect from your own dishonesty, you damage the credibility of legitimate civil rights advocacy. The systematic damage to social trust and racial progress was particularly damning because it showed how Reid's behavior hurt the very causes she claimed to champion. But most importantly, Vivek continued, when you attack successful minorities like me as sellouts or enablers, you're sending a message to minority communities that success requires ideological conformity, that achievement must be accompanied by political orthodoxy, that the American dream is only valid if it comes with the right political opinions. The attack on American opportunity was being exposed as fundamentally racist in its own way, suggesting that minorities could only succeed on progressive terms rather than their own merit. So when you call me a white supremacist enabler, Vivek said, his voice reaching a crescendo, I have to ask, what's more dangerous? A minority who succeeded in America and wants to extend that opportunity to others? Or a media personality who spreads conspiracy theories, lies to cover up past mistakes, and uses racial identity as a shield against accountability? The comparison was devastating because it highlighted the fundamental difference between constructive and destructive approaches to racial progress. You want to know what real dangerous rhetoric looks like? Vivek asked, his voice carrying the weight of moral authority. It's telling minority communities that they can't succeed without special programs. It's convincing them that merit-based systems are inherently racist. It's teaching them that their identity matters more than their character or achievements. The critique of progressive racial ideology was particularly powerful because it came from someone who had actually achieved success through the meritocratic system that Reid attacked. Real dangerous rhetoric is telling young minorities that America is a white supremacist country where they can't succeed. Vivek continued. It's convincing them that their race defines their opportunities rather than their effort and talent. It's teaching them to see racism everywhere instead of seeing possibilities. The psychological damage caused by progressive racial messaging was being exposed, showing how it discouraged rather than empowered minority advancement. And you know what I find most insulting about your attack? Vivek asked, his voice taking on a tone of genuine anger. You're suggesting that my success somehow delegitimized the experiences of other minorities, that my achievements come at the expense of racial progress, rather than as an example of what's possible in America. The fundamental anti-American premise of Reid's worldview was being exposed, showing how it rejected the very concept of individual achievement and opportunity. My success doesn't threaten other minorities, Joy, Vivek said, his voice growing stronger. It inspires them. It shows them what's possible when you focus on excellence rather than victimhood, when you build rather than complain, when you take responsibility for your own future rather than blaming others for your circumstances. The positive message of individual empowerment was a stark contrast to Reid's narrative of systemic oppression and collective grievance. So Joy, Vivek said, beginning to stand up, the next time you want to accuse someone of spreading dangerous rhetoric, maybe you should examine your own history of conspiracy theories and false claims. The next time you want to lecture someone about their impact on minority communities, maybe you should consider how your own lies and racial divisiveness have damaged those communities. He gathered his thoughts for his final statement. And the next time you want to attack a successful minority as a sellout or enabler, maybe you should ask yourself whether you're fighting for racial progress or just protecting your own relevance in a media landscape that rewards division over truth. His final words would echo in that studio long after the interview was over. I'll keep building businesses, creating opportunities, and showing young Americans of all backgrounds that success is possible through hard work and excellence. You can keep spreading conspiracy theories, dividing communities, and teaching people to see themselves as victims rather than victors. The silence that followed was profound and complete. Reid sat motionless behind her desk, her moral authority completely destroyed by the exposure of her own history of spreading false information and using racial identity to avoid accountability. Her righteous indignation and progressive activism had been turned against her, revealing the cynical opportunism at the core of her media career. The studio audience sat in stunned silence, many clearly uncomfortable with what they had learned about their progressive hero. The other MSNBC personalities looked around uncertainly, unsure how to respond to such a devastating exposure of their colleagues' conspiracy theories and racial manipulation. The confrontation between Vivek Ramaswamy and Joy Reid had exposed something crucial about American media culture: the dangerous combination of conspiracy thinking and racial grievance politics that had come to define much of progressive commentary. It had highlighted how media personalities used racial identity as both a weapon against opponents and a shield against criticism, creating a toxic environment where truth mattered less than tribal loyalty. Most importantly, it had demonstrated that all the moral authority in the world couldn't overcome the simple truth that credibility required honesty, that racial progress required individual achievement rather than collective grievance, and that the American people deserved better than being lectured by conspiracy theorists who used identity politics to hide their own dishonesty. The age of unquestioned progressive racial authority was over. The age of demanding truth from all media personalities had begun. And it had started with an entrepreneur from Ohio who had the courage to challenge a conspiracy theorist from New York with the most powerful weapon in politics: the truth about her own record of spreading false information.